These are a number of companies and organisations that I've worked with throughout the years. So you can begin to see the influences that might occur on me over that time. These are the things I need to speak about. A little bit about the epidemiology of fibre and diabetes, and interventions with resistant dextrins and then fructose, and the reason why we're looking at that. This is really just to say something which you've already learned from Walter this morning, that there is a relationship between cellular fibre intake and the incidence of diabetes. So this is a meta-analysis, a dose-response meta-analysis. So it's really very clearly a relationship there. What we have now is something which is slightly different to what Walter was saying this morning, that fibre from fruit in these studies was not effective at suggesting that there may be a relationship with type 2 diabetes. So there's some heterogeneity in the data, it seems, and I'll come back to that again later. And the same with vegetable fibre as well, because Walter did suggest there was some small effect. We'll come back to that again later. So my reason for showing that was maybe not all fibres are equal. Maybe. It is a maybe. Or maybe fermentable fibre per se is not protective of type 2 diabetes. So that's the question now for, well, what about these isolated fibres? One piece of work we did was looking at resistant maltodextrin. A great deal of work had been done in Japan and hadn't entered the Western understanding at any of the Western literature. But what we were able to find was a very large number of studies that when the resistant maltodextrin was added to a food or to a drink, there was a decrease in the glycemic response to the carbohydrate that was consumed. And what occurred here was that refined carbohydrates, maltodextrin and sucrose, were being replaced. So that effectively you've got more than what is just dietary fibre, it's a reduction in glycemic load as well. It can be less effective when incorporated into foods than when in a drink. Now there's some similarity here with sugars in beverages as well. One begins to wonder that we should treat drinks differently in terms of putting these sorts of things. It occurs when different types of drinks are consumed. Here's just one example here, not of drinks now, but of rice, of the individual studies rather than looking at the meta-analysis results. So it's a fairly clear-cut influence. What we do see is that when these things have been fed to people, both normal diabetic individuals, normal and diabetic individuals, there's an influence of the dose of the resistant maltodextrin, and there's an important dependence on the severity of the diabetes. So if you multiply these together, you get a sort of composite picture. And what you find is that there is a reduction in overall blood glucose. What I have to say about these is that it looks great data, but none of these studies were controlled studies, so one has to be very careful with that. But it does look that there is the prospect of that influence. And now I want to take a quick look at fructans, and again, it's going to be a short talk on this one. There are a number of fructans, but there are not so many studies on fructans, so I tend to bulk them all together and think about inulin, oligofructose, and fructooligosaccharides in the same sentence. But as more studies are performed, then we shall find perhaps that there are some differences between them. One study here, again, now this is one which has had a control, that in fact there is a decrease in the fasting blood glucose, and it really does depend on the severity of fasting blood of diabetes in the first instance as measured by fasting blood glucose. So there's a very clear picture there, and that's very much like it was with the glycemic load and glycemic index in the epidemiological studies. In the interventional studies, that is when someone has more severe perturbation in blood glucose, then the effects of these are correspondingly larger. Again, meta-analyses with fructans, but not in individuals without diabetes. There doesn't seem to be any influence there on blood glucose control or taking any of these fructans, but there is in the type 2 diabetes, and this influence that was shown in the individual study that consuming more of the fructans reduces blood glucose to a greater extent in people with more severe diabetes is reflected again in the epidemiological studies. What might be true, though, is that with the inulin-type fructans and others, that when one looks at the insulin resistance, there is a small improvement of 15% in or decrease in insulin resistance. So there may well be benefits which are not reflected in blood glucose control. There are only a few studies, unfortunately, in type 2 diabetics, so we can't really know what's happening there, but the suggestion is that maybe there is a reduction in insulin resistance in these individuals. I want quickly to move on to other aspects. Now, here this is results that I put together from a systematic review and meta-analyses from Liu et al. This is a different Liu to Simin. It's demonstrated there in tabular form. Sometimes it's rather difficult to understand what's going on in tabular form, but what you can see that in healthy subject there are no significant effects, whereas if you get down to individuals with diabetes, one tends to find that there are significant influences. Not so much so in this meta-analysis for the fasting glucose effects, but I think that's because they just pulled all the individual studies in one simple meta-analysis and didn't take account of the severity of the condition. But we can see a little clearly now, I think, that when you look down below at the fasting blood glucose, there's a range of influences on fasting blood glucose depending upon the health condition of the individual, and there's corresponding changes with blood glucose of the LDL, of the insulin, of the fasting LDL and the fasting HDL. So there's a decrease as you increase the fructans, then there's a decrease in blood glucose and a corresponding, possibly decreasing LDL, and a corresponding, possibly, rise in HDL. So more data would probably help in enhancing that picture. There's more influences, of course, than just effects on blood glucose, but the ectopic reduction in fat has been extremely important over the last 10 years, I would say. And here's one study that a randomized controlled trial in humans in a pre-diabetic state showing that consumption of inulin-type fructans will decrease the well, this was of inulin itself, not inulin fructan, but inulin itself decreasing ectopic fat. So that's again suggesting that there can be improvements with these sort of substances. And I did say I'd give a short talk, so we'll be able to move along fairly swiftly afterwards, I think. That one of the questions that comes up is what about putting these things in with as symbiotics with other organisms? And what we find is what we see here is that there seems to be a larger influence, but a smaller number of studies. Unfortunately, I haven't put the numbers up there. The number of studies in symbiotics there is 4, so that's not concrete data as yet, but it's looking with quite good potential. But overall, there's a fall of 25 to 40% in excess blood glucose within these studies. Now, here, this is my last slide, or well, it's my next to last slide, so you can tell this is a short presentation. I did say something about the epidemiology of healthy carbohydrates, and what I was saying is that the fibre, that the size of the effect on diabetes might depend on the source of the fibre. But as we'll come on to this afternoon, GI and GL is also important as sugary beverages, and these are things which we've heard about from other speakers this morning. The regional differences I shall speak about again this afternoon, perhaps. The intervention of resistant dextrins, well, there's evidence suggesting non-viscous fibres can lower postprandial blood glucose response. I think that's an important observation. So we shouldn't just assume that it's got to be viscous to get one of these influences. But there's a real need for some properly controlled RCT studies to show there's a real benefit in diabetes in that case. The intervention with inulin-type fructans is stronger. The evidence suggests a benefit in diabetes control, potential control of good, bad cholesterol and ectopic lipid mass. And that, well, I mentioned to begin with, we're talking about these things are fibre. I said in some of these, all of these studies nearly, there's a replacement of glycemic carbohydrates. So there's a fibre, there's a glycemic load influence, and there's possibly a symbiotic influence, or perhaps the symbiotic is part of the mechanism of the fibre. And I'm going to finish swiftly and say thank you to everyone for being so kind.